Welcome to Sunday Sermons, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verses 19 through 27. And I'll read verses 21 through 23 for us now, as we prepare to hear from lead Pastor Travis Simone as he helps us close out our sermon series titled, Trusting on the Road Between. Thus says the Lord, take care for the sake of your lives, and do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day, or bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. And do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath, or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your fathers. Yet they did not listen or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck, that they might not hear and receive instruction.
I was out to breakfast the other day and couldn't help but overhear the person in the next booth place their order. It was an older gentleman sitting with what appeared to be his daughter. He said, I'll have 2 eggs, over easy, home fries, and Virginia ham. And came the cry from his daughter, what? Your heart, all the salt will destroy your heart. He said, it's just a little ham. She said, and you could tell the waiter was a little baffled. What do I do? Do I bring him the ham? Do I not? Translation, the daughter was looking at her dad saying, Dad, you can't eat like that and survive. You can't live like that and survive. And in Jeremiah 17, the prophet sounds a lot like that man's concerned daughter. He says, take care. For the sake of your lives, do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day. Translation, you can't live like that and survive. You can't keep violating the Sabbath and live. You see, Babylon is bearing down on Jerusalem. The impending destruction of the city of Jerusalem by Babylon lurks in the background of everything God instructs Jeremiah to say. The time to repent, the time to turn around, the time to change direction is now or never. Verse 27. But if you do not listen to keep the Sabbath day holy, and not to bear a burden and enter by the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and shall not be quenched. Listen and live, Jeremiah says. Refuse to listen, exile, destruction, death. But why Sabbath? I mean, resting one day a week is kind of a nice to have kind of thing. But for the sake of your lives, I'm not so sure, Jeremiah. I'd understand if the prophet was talking about big sin, idolatry, apostasy, adultery, murder. And yet, with Babylon at the gates, God speaks through Jeremiah. For the sake of your lives, do not bear a burden on the Sabbath. Why? Why is this the one commandment God picks out of all the ones he could have chosen? Well, in our series up till now, we've said that Sabbath is rest. Sabbath is release. It's rest for the human body. It's release of debt obligations, release of slaves to freedom. Last week we said Sabbath is a reminder. It's a reminder of who owns what. Today in Jeremiah 17, we learn that Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. You see, embedded in the Sabbath was a return to the fundamentals of a healthy relationship with God. Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. First, it's a return to trust. See, in verse 21, God's people are instructed not to bear a burden on the Sabbath day. We tend to think of this in terms of carrying a heavy load for work. But what's actually in view here is commerce. The same word, bear a burden, is used in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. Nehemiah is dealing with some similar issues after the Babylonian exile. And there it's translated, the same word is translated as loading, as in loading donkeys with food to be sold. It's then translated as loads, as in loads of goods to be sold. The same is true in Jeremiah 17. They were bringing loads of stuff to be sold at the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And this gets at one of the key points we've made throughout the series. Through the prophet, God says, return to trust that I will provide for your needs. Trust not in your ability to outwork the competition. Trust not in your ability to close the sale. Trust not in your strategic plan. Return to trust in the Lord. Return to trust that what I have provided on days 1 through 6 is enough. Earlier in Jeremiah 17, trust is a major theme. And the verses we read are really bringing us back to some of what was said earlier. I want you to listen. I'm going to read chapter 17, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8. I want you to listen to the differences between the person who trusts in man and the person who trusts in the Lord. Jeremiah 17, verse 5. Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert and shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Now listen to the person who trusts in the Lord. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. See, trusting in the Lord versus not trusting in the Lord, it's the difference between curse and blessing. Parched places and streams of water, fruit and salt, seeing no good thing, and an anxiety-free life. So Jeremiah says, for the sake of your lives, Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. Return to trust. And then return to creation. Look at the first part of verse 22 with me. Jeremiah says, and do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath, or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy. Calling the day holy, Jeremiah brings his hearers back to the first Sabbath in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work he had done in creation. Remember, not only is no other day in creation made holy, nothing else in all the creation story is made holy. The Sabbath is the first thing in the Bible that is made holy. And holiness in this context has to do with possession, ownership. God claims the seventh day as his very own. Now remember, in the creation story, humanity is created on day 6. and given a massive job to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, to have dominion. When I preached that sermon, I said, big job. Really big job that God gives them. They are to rule wisely as stewards of the resources of God's realm. And after receiving their big job assignment on day 6, instead of God asking them to get to work on day 7, God rests. And humanity's first experience of creation is God at rest. And so when Jeremiah says, keep the Sabbath day holy, he is inviting God's people to return to creation, return to God's orderly design for creation, to return to how God first intended them to experience life at rest, trusting God's sovereign care over creation. After all the sin that Jeremiah has seen, after all the violence, after all the corruption, after all the injustice, the sexual immorality, after all the hurt, the brokenness, the loneliness, God through Jeremiah reminds his people, it wasn't always like this. For the sake of your lives, Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. Return to creation and return to freedom. The second half of verse 22, Jeremiah says, as I commanded your fathers, keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your fathers. Not only were God's people to return to creation by keeping the Sabbath day holy, they were to do it as was commanded. You see, here Jeremiah is pointing to the fourth commandment as recorded in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. In Exodus, the reason for keeping the Sabbath is related to the creation story. God says through Moses there, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and rested on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy 5, the reason to keep the Sabbath is related to the Exodus. You shall remember you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. By not observing the Sabbath, God's people were re-enslaving themselves. They returned to Egypt in their hearts, believing that if they did not meet their proverbial quota of bricks, they would not have enough. They would not be enough. They were enslaved to the most brutal master of all, the self. They sought self-reliance, self-security. With Babylon outside the gates, they sought self-trust, self-identity, self-wealth creation. Biblical scholar Terence Fredheim puts it like this: we have seen that self-reliance is the central pathology of this people. Sabbath fidelity is one surrender of such self-reliance. What we've learned throughout the series is that on the Sabbath, God's people did not have to do more, be more, make more, sell more, or win more. They were given the freedom to stop. Remember how captivity in Egypt ended. What finally led Pharaoh to release God's people? It was the 10th plague. The plague of the death of the firstborn. Slavery in Egypt and slavery to self only leads to one place: death. And so God says, for the sake of your lives, Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. Return to the freedom that I bought for you, releasing you from Egypt. And then return to covenant. Look at verse 23. Yet they did not listen or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck that they might not hear and receive instruction. This verse describes the disobedience of God's people with two of the most important Hebrew words related to God's covenant with Israel in the Old Testament. And I'm going to point them out here to help you in your own Bible study. When you start seeing some of these translations, you can start imagining some of these important Hebrew words behind the text. The first word is Shema, and the second word is Torah. When God says they did not listen, they did not Shema, which is the famous word from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, Shema, O Israel. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. That Israel's faith starts with this call to listen. And the Hebrew word has the connotation of hearing, of listening, but also of obedience. In the Bible, literally to hear was intended to be obedience. To hear was to obey. And then he says they stiffened their neck that they might not hear or receive instruction. And that word there is the word Torah. Torah, often as we say in English. We refer to the first 5 books of the Bible with this word. It's actually a Hebrew word that means teaching, instruction, law. They did not receive instruction. They wouldn't receive my Torah, God says. So by failing to obey the Sabbath command, God's people failed at 2 critical tasks for relationship with God. They did not listen, and they would not receive instruction. And chapter 17 opens up with this dramatic image. It's stunning. I'll read it to you here. If you have a Bible, check out 17:1. It'll hit you right between the eyes. The sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron, with a point of a diamond. It is engraved on the tablet of their heart and on the horns of their altar. A pen of iron, the strongest metal, the point of a diamond, the strongest, the hardest rock. This is what engraved sin onto the hearts of God's people. Patrick Miller, commenting on this verse, said, something will be written on the heart, either sin or Torah. Either sin will be written on your heart or God's instruction will be written on your heart. But still, I have this question. Why Sabbath? It was just the Sabbath. Why is God making such a big deal out of this one commandment? The answer to that question lies in Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 through 14. And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, again, very surprising, above all else you shall keep my Sabbaths. Why? For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Again, with Babylon at the gates, God calls his people to return to Sabbath because the Sabbath was the sign of the covenant. To return to Sabbath was to return to covenant. That is, to return to right relationship with God. To violate the Sabbath wasn't just to work a little too much. It was to reject God's covenant, to reject his claim on your life, to reject his steadfast love, to reject his rescue from slavery in Egypt. This is why, as strange as it sounds to us, I'm trying to make the strange familiar for us today. As strange as it sounds to us, the penalty was death. Because to reject the covenant meant that spiritually they were already dead. The social, economic, political, and military consequences that eventually came with Babylon's invasion, it was inevitable due to the spiritual death that already occurred. Walt Kaiser, great Old Testament scholar, he said, infringing on the rights and prerogatives that belonged only to God is placing one's soul at risk. Or as I've said many times at the chapel, when God says don't, he means don't hurt yourself. So Jeremiah stands at the city gates and proclaims, for the sake of your lives, Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. Return to covenant. But they did not return. They did not return to trust, to creation, to freedom, to covenant. So just as God said through Jeremiah, Babylon kindled the gates of Jerusalem with fire, devoured the palaces, destroyed the temple, deported the people. You see, it truly was for the sake of their lives that God called them to return. It was a sad moment. It was a painful moment. It's a moment worth reflecting on and then asking, well, how did God respond? It's in Jeremiah 31. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. God says, I will return to them. If they won't return to me, I will return to them. And God does this in and as Jesus Christ. And the Apostle Paul connects the Sabbath clearly to Jesus Christ when he writes this in Colossians. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. See, Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of everything the Sabbath offered God's people. You see, the return to trust. Jesus is the true human who trusts God fully in his garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but your will be done. The return to creation. In the resurrection, Jesus becomes the firstborn of the new creation. The return to freedom, he is the one that sets us free from slavery to sin and its consequence, death. And the return to covenant, he is the one who establishes the new covenant in my blood at the Last Supper. When we would not return to Sabbath, the Lord of the Sabbath returned to us. At the end of John's gospel, John summarizes everything he's told you about Jesus with these words. He writes, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Sounds a lot like, for the sake of your lives. For the sake of your lives, believe in him. For the sake of your lives, trust in him. For the sake of your lives, place your ultimate hope and trust in him. My favorite movie is Terminator 2. That's probably not what you were expecting to get from the pulpit this morning. If the elders don't fire me immediately, I'll finish the sermon. But in Terminator 2, there's this great scene where the Terminator has broken into a high-security psychiatric hospital where Sarah Connor has been held because she keeps telling everyone about these visions that she has of a future where the machines take over the world, where something called Skynet, sound like the cloud, anyone? Something called Skynet becomes self-aware, sound like AI, anyone? And when the humans try to shut it down, they launch a nuclear attack against humanity. And she's seen it in the future. And she is the mother of the child that leads the human resistance, John Connor. See, I'm a little bit into this movie. And so in the first movie, the Terminator gets sent back from the future because the machines figured out how to invent time travel. And he is supposed to kill Sarah Connor so the leader of the resistance never gets born. How about that for a movie plot? But in the second movie, two Terminators, that's why it's called Terminator 2. No, it's the second one, but two Terminators are sent back in time. One to kill Sarah Connor, the other to protect Sarah Connor. And so as the Terminator breaks into the psychiatric facility, when she first sees him, she recoils with horror. She screams out, "No!" Because she thinks this is the Terminator that's come to kill her. And he looks at her and he says, "Come with me if you want to live." And she's horrified. She's running the other direction. The psychiatric medical team tackles her. They're about to shoot her with a syringe to calm her down when the other Terminator shows up. And she realizes something bigger is going on. And he looks at her and says, "Come with me if you want to live." See, at the end of our series, Trusting on the Road Between, looking at Sabbath principles of the Old Testament to help us learn to trust God in the wilderness places of life, we're all in the same position as Sarah Connor. We're all in the same position as God's people at the time of Jeremiah. We've been conditioned by our culture that to live well means don't return to trust. Trust yourself. Don't return to creation. Create your own identity. And don't return to freedom that involves someone else's rules. That's not freedom at all. And don't return to covenant. Seek independence. The Sabbath principle, on the other hand, pushes us to practice returning to the things that comprise life with God, especially when you see it in light of Colossians 2, as pushing you to return to Jesus Christ. It can serve as a one-week reset button that returns your soul to its intended original factory settings of trust, creation, freedom, and covenant. And I want to acknowledge that in our interdenominational family of faith, people have different conceptions of how to practice this and how much Christ, when what Paul said in Colossians 2 supersedes some of these commands in the Old Testament. I mean, our church is located right next door to a church that believes the Seventh-day Adventist, that you should still practice Sabbath on the seventh day. Christians have debated this for all of the history of the church. And at the chapel, we practice Paul's command in Romans 14 to welcome one another, even when we have differences over these issues of biblical interpretation. And so Please know I want to talk more about that. You can't do everything in one single sermon. We might host an evening about this toward the end of the series, but I get to be the preacher today. And so here's one final clear application of Sabbath principles from the Old Testament that I would submit to the chapel family to consider. Stop to pray. Stop to play. Remember, the word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew verb to stop, to cease, to desist. And so my application that I hope we can talk about in our small groups is, what do you need to stop in order to pray? What do you need to stop in order to play? And so I'm going to close by allowing someone much smarter than me to explain these ideas of pray and play. I'm going to read a long quote from an article written by Eugene Peterson from 1988 in Christianity Today. Eugene Peterson is the translator of the Message version of the Bible. And in 1988, Christianity Today put out a survey of questions their readers had. And the number one question, they were surprised, it wasn't the problem of human suffering. It was, should God's people take their Lord's Day practices more seriously? And in response, Eugene Peterson wrote a great essay, and I'll read an excerpt from it here in closing. The surest way to keep Sabbath keeping honest and holy is to return the practice continually to its biblical reasons. In its basic form, the Sabbath command is given twice, first in Exodus, then in Deuteronomy, but each time with a different reason. The Exodus reason is that God rested on the seventh day, marking it with blessing and holiness. Sabbath keeping gets us into step with the rhythm of the Creator. It is a day for praying. The Deuteronomy reason is that the people have been saved from Egyptian slavery, 400 years without a day off. Sabbath keeping gets us into step with the rhythm of the Savior. It is social justice, the gracious relief from the oppression of sin. It is a day for playing. How we keep the day is not biblically prescribed. That we keep the day is commanded. And though not every follower of Jesus would agree with that last word, commanded, Jeremiah certainly would, though he would likely add, for the sake of your lives, for the sake of your lives, return, because Sabbath is rest, release, reminder, and return. Let's return to stop to pray and return to stop to play in God's beautiful creation in which He's given us the Sabbath.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we hope you'll join us as we walk the Exodus way and learn to trust God on the way out of Egypt, the way between in the wilderness, and the way into His presence.